All right, so today we are in Darkness and Light, part 9. Okay, part 9. And we are going to continue here in this journey. Remember, we've been looking in the Brit Chadashah, especially at darkness and light from the idea of it being related to how we are under authority. I mean, we already talked about darkness being a natural state at the beginning and a place where something is birthed from and all those kind of things, and a place maybe devoid of actively useful light. There may be light, but it might not be actively useful at that point. And light being related to bringing life and safety, deliverance, etc., illuminating our path. But mostly we've been talking about it here from the point of view of submission. When you're in darkness, you tend not to be under authority or under the wrong authority. And when you're in light, you are under submission to Elohim's authority. So we're going to go into the book of Romans now, the letter to the Romans, in chapter 2. Let's begin in chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 17. Okay, now in this section, we're going to see Shaul call out his Jewish brothers for being hypocrites in their role as guides to the blind. Remember, we talked about blind being not having light and having the blind see, where they're now having light revealed to them. And they're supposed to be lights to those in darkness. And he's going to pick on them for not doing the best job at this point when he was doing his ministry. He says, "See, you are called a Jew, a Yehudite, and you rest on the Torah and make your boast in Elohim. And know the desire of Elohim and approve what is superior, being instructed out of the Torah." And by the way, he is not making any kind of sarcasm there. This is the superior stuff. It is superior to any man-made laws, self-sovereign laws. It is superior. That which is of Elohim is superior to all. And you are trusting that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. In other words, this is the way they were seeing themselves, that they were there to guide the blind and be a light to those in darkness. An instructor of foolish ones, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and of the truth in the Torah. Now, let me interrupt myself here just for two things. One is, he's primarily talking to these Jewish leaders, so he's not talking to them about their failure in speaking to Gentiles. Okay? He's talking about their failure as leaders of the Jewish community and the scattered Israelites. Those are those in darkness, primarily the scattered Israelites. That's the core base that the scriptures talks about. Of course, in the effort to bring those out of darkness, there's going to be the opportunity to bring everyone out of darkness. Okay? But let's just remember again in our context that Paul here is talking to the Jewish community. And in Paul talking to the community, he's saying, you think of yourselves as being guides to the blind and bringing light to those in darkness. You're trusting that you yourself are doing these things, that you're an instructor of foolish ones, a teacher of babes. And then there's this verse part that says, having the form of knowledge and the truth of in the Torah. And there are people that will pick on that verse saying that they only had a form of knowledge and this, that. He's not picking on them yet. They know the right form of knowledge. This is not a negative at this point. And that they understand that there's truth in the Torah. They understand, in other words, they understand the form knowledge is supposed to take. But he's calling them hypocrites because they are not doing what they know and they should be, and that even at times they're teaching, but they're not doing. This is the hypocrisy. Yeshua tells them, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which is hypocrisy, right? So watch what he says. You then who teach another, do you not teach yourself? So now we're understanding that everything he said before this was stating what should be. It's not stating what was wrong yet. He said, look, you're supposed to be those who rest in the Torah and make your boast in Elohim, saying we are the children of Elohim, that we know the desire of Elohim and we approve what is superior. It's superior to be doing what Yahweh says than any other thing. You're supposed to be those that are instructed out of the Torah. You're supposed to be those that are guiding blind, light being brought to those in darkness, instructing foolish ones, teaching babes, understanding the form knowledge is supposed to take. Remember, it's a relational thing. You're supposed to know the truth in the Torah. You then who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who proclaim that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abominate idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in Torah through the transgression of the Torah, do you disrespect Elohim? Now we're finding out the problem. The problem was not till this point. Now he's laying out the problem is. You make your boast in Torah, but you transgress the Torah. Isn't that disrespectful? See, you know, and he's not attacking them for their knowledge. You know what you're supposed to be doing. You are called, your eyes are open, your ears are open, you have understanding, but you're teaching, but you're not doing. He said, if you're teaching people not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You're teaching people not to steal, but are you stealing? He's saying, you're teaching them correctly, but then how's your behavior? Is it matching what you're expecting others to do? He says, you who make your boast in Torah, through the transgression of the Torah, do you disrespect Elohim? Now, they're not boasting in Torah through the transgression. It says, you who make your boast in Torah, when you're transgressing it, aren't you disrespecting Elohim? He says, for the name of Elohim is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as has been written. And by the way, the documentation, as it has been written, is not necessarily out of the Torah itself, but just the fact that it's well documented, your behaviors. And by the way, where has it been written? How they're blaspheming? Look at all of the prophets talking about Israel and Judah messing up. It's been written everywhere. You claim to be of Elohim, but your actions go somewhat against what you claim. It's not in line with what you claim. He's saying, look, so he's really getting on them for their hypocrisy. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the talk. They sound good, but the doing doesn't follow. Yeshua says the same thing when he says, don't do what they do, but when they're on Moses' seat teaching you what Moses said, you got to do what they say. Yeshua tells us just as much in Matthew 23, I believe, right there in the first couple of verses. So, he says here, and starting in verse 25 now, so he's giving them this sort of strong sort of chastisement. And remember, the darkness and light thing has already been brought up in verse 19. He says, look, you're supposed to be bringing light to those in darkness. But now you're actually bringing darkness because you're bringing confusion. You're not bringing light. You're telling them one thing, but you're not doing another. And of course, we have the old saying of, your actions speak so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. People imitate more what you do than what you say. So the mother or the father that sits there telling their child not to smoke while there's cigarettes in their hand and they're smoking. What is the child hearing? Nothing. They're watching them smoke, right? See, or you're telling the child not to do A, but you're doing it, or B, and you're doing it. They're not hearing you because they see that the walk doesn't match the talk, and so it's very hard for them to follow. Then he goes into the next couple of verses and kind of explains in his own metaphors. Let's be careful, and I've taught this before, but we'll teach it again here, about the metaphors that he uses, the picture. He goes, for circumcision indeed profits if you practice the Torah. So we're going to take the word circumcision to mean the person that is covenanted through birth. They're born into covenant because they're circumcised, after all, on the 8th day. So it's not something they actively covenanted. He's talking to the Jewish community here. He's saying, for being born into covenant, okay, that's my own, you don't have to like it, you can say I'm wrong, but that's my own expounding, okay? I'm amplifying it with, for being born into covenant indeed profits you if you practice the Torah, which is, of course, that's part of the covenant, is that you would keep Torah. But if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your being born into covenant has become as if you were not born into covenant. As if you had become a Gentile. So if you are being born, he says, listen, if you're born into covenant, it profits you only if you keep covenant. But if you transgress the covenant by transgressing the Torah, your transgression takes your being born in and makes it as if you were a Gentile. Verse 26. So if a Gentile, or one not born into covenant, watches over the righteousness of the Torah, shall not his being uncovenanted now be reckoned as if he is covenanted? In other words, isn't the covenant about the part that we agreed to do? Right? The covenant wasn't just to cut a piece of flesh away. That was only a sign that you had made a commitment to do all that he says. That was a sign in the flesh of the walk you committed to. Whatever he says, we shall do. So he says, if an uncovenanted person keeps the covenant command of doing and watching over everything he says, isn't there not being covenanted now reckoned as being covenanted? This has nothing, by the way, to do with physical circumcision. That's the problem. A Christian will read this, and a lot of Messianics will read this and get all confused. Because a lot of Messianics out there and Hebrew roots people teach you don't have to get circumcised anymore. See, most of the confusion out there, which is why people are doing movies about this and everything else to attack what we're doing in the Hebrew roots, is because most of the teachers in the Hebrew roots don't know what they're talking about half the time. I'm not trying to just attack, I'm trying to get you to understand. They're confused about things like the relationship between salvation, faith, and works. They're confused about circumcision because they don't understand that Paul is not talking about circumcision. Oh, but he said it so many times. But that's not what he's talking about. He's saying, what's the point in having the sign of something you're not doing? Then the sign might as well not be there. Okay? Now, and by the way, he's talking about those born into it. He's saying if those that were born Gentiles keep the covenant, doesn't that get reckoned to them as being the right way to be? That doesn't mean they still don't need to get circumcised. That's the whole argument in Acts chapter 15. Acts 15 is all about when do they have to get circumcised, not whether or not they have to. Okay? Now, so he says, and this in verse 27 now, and the Gentile by nature, this is what we're talking about, the one who was born uncircumcised, wasn't circumcised on the 8th day, was born a Gentile, who has integrity in the Torah. That the word perfection there is, again, through Hebrew would have been like the idea of tamim. Who, through his having integrity with the Torah, shall judge you, who notwithstanding letter, in other words, you were trained and you were born and you've got the genealogy certificate. In other words, you've got the lineage and the documents to show you're of the covenanted line. He said, notwithstanding that you have letter and that you were born and circumcised into this whole thing, they're going to judge you who are a transgressor of the Torah. Wow. I thought Paul was against the Torah. Why is he making such a big issue? I mean, after all, if they're not keeping it and the other, he says, good for you not keeping it. Why didn't he just say that? It's been done away with, leave it alone, forget it. No, he says, these people who are going to watch over it and have integrity with it, they're going to judge you, notwithstanding that you have the birth. You were born into it. You were raised and came into this when you were born. You were already in a covenanted people. So he's trying to show them that birth doesn't matter, choice matters. Okay? Verse 28, for he is not a Yehudite who is so outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. So he's not saying that the flesh is enough. Just circumcising the flesh doesn't do it. He says, but a Yehudite is he who is so inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart and spirit, not literally, whose praise is not from men, but from Elohim. So there he's saying that, look, you guys who physically had this done at the 8th day, you're covenanted by birth, you can't just rest on that. Okay, you can't just sit there going, well, it's kind of like the altar call person thinks they're in because they made an altar call. The Jew who was circumcised, well, I'm in. I got a circumcision on the 8th day. Well, most of the boys born in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s got circumcised on the first day, but they were still circumcised. So what does that prove? You know? Doesn't prove anything. He's saying it's the covenant that matters, and the covenant is in the heart, a choice to submit and to do all that comes out of his mouth. He says, if you will do everything that I say, then we will have a covenant. And then I will take you as my people. Not just because you happen to cut off a little bit of flesh. Because anybody could do that. That doesn't prove anything. Okay, but it's supposed to be a sign of something, though. A sign of the inward change, of the inward man, of the circumcision of the heart. And the heart, and it's in spirit, which means it's in the fullness of the understanding of the intent, not just in the basic simplicity, but it's how it's fully intended. Because otherwise, it's about, again, the comparison that Paul does a lot, this comparison between, and Yeshua did it too, seeking the praise of men versus seeking the praise of Elohim. So we have here this challenge where, as he's talking to those in Rome, we don't seem to understand today how strong the challenge was between the Gentile people who came into the congregation, the assembly, after Yeshua was resurrected, and the Jews that came into the assembly. The tension, the angst, they did not like each other. Both groups wanted to find reasons why the other group shouldn't be there. The Gentiles wanted the Jews not to be there. You blew it, it's our turn type of thing. And the Jews wanted the Gentiles not to be there because, after all, you're a Gentile. This is about us. We were born into this. And Paul's trying to say, you know what? Calm down. Get off your high horse. Stop thinking you're up on that pedestal like you're so big deal. You're only a big deal if you do what he says. You're not a big deal just because you were born into this. And you certainly aren't a big deal because your parents did this to you at 8 days old. You had nothing to do with that. That was a commitment of them to raise you a certain way. It wasn't a commitment on your part. You were 8 days old. You don't even remember it. And so why do you think you're such a big deal? He's saying, look, you had, as part of this covenant, to be a set-apart people, which was then supposed to be set up on a hill to be a light to those in darkness. This gets back to the whole light and darkness thing. Our walking out covenant is shining light for people to see what it looks like to be in the light. Remember, they think they have light. It's just not actively useful light, even though they're in darkness. So it's not literal darkness like where they can't see anything, but the light that they're seeing by is not the true light. It's not actively useful, even though they can see. They just can't really see, because that takes having eyes open from above. They have to have eyes to see. So here's Paul, giving the Jewish community here a good little poke. So some of you think that I'm tough. Well, he was being tough on his community. I say the same thing on the community I have to deal with, the leadership that I have to go out there and deal with, who are, Paul's saying, look, you guys are not helping. That's basically what Paul's saying. So there's a work to be done here, and you guys out there who are teaching one thing and doing another thing are not helping the situation. And that's why I say the same thing from time to time. There's a lot of teachers out there doing some good things. There's a lot of other ones that are not helping. But they think they are. But they're not. And so I'm just following Paul's example, I guess, when I call some of that out, because it's adding to the confusion. Because people are assuming that whoever's got a microphone must know what they're talking about. Don't assume that. Okay, that's not always the case. It's more often than not the case. Okay, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I don't think you guys are so used to me spending so much time in the Brit Hadashah, huh? 2 Corinthians chapter 11. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13. Just got a couple of verses here. He says, for such are false emissaries, deceptive workers, masquerading as emissaries of Messiah. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as a messenger of light. And it is not surprising then if his servants are also masquerading as servants of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. You see what's going on? We have to be careful. Just because something looks like it's light and it sounds good to you and everything else, don't just be fooled by that. It's like beware false prophets teaching in Deuteronomy 13 when it says there are those who will speak certain things to happen, and when they actually do happen, it's easy when they don't happen to call them false. But when they actually happen the way they say they will, well, then they look true, don't they? He says, but to what end? He says, look, be careful of those who are false emissaries, deceptive workers, masquerading as emissaries of Messiah, and no wonder. Now, here's the thing. Most of them are doing it completely thinking, as in other verses that Yeshua has said, there are those that will go and try to have you put to death that think they're doing Elohim's work. Okay, they think they're doing Elohim's work. So in this case with Satan and his servants, they know exactly what they're doing. But there are those that are going to get wrapped up in following them that are going to believe they're in the truth. They're in the light. They're in the true light. You know, in John 1, we were told this one is the true light when he was describing Yeshua. To be the true light, that has to also mean that there's a false light. You know, if Satan himself, unlike the way the world wants us to think of him, were to show up right now, you would think that it was at least Yeshua, if not Elohim himself. That's how impressive he would look. He wouldn't be some scary monster with red horns and a tail and all that other stuff. That's the lie that the church wanted you to believe. That he would be this very easy and obvious thing to scare everybody. No, Paul tells us very clearly that he, Satan himself, looks like a messenger of light. How else would even the elect have the possibility of being deceived and falling for him? So it's not surprising then that if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. If that's what's going on out there, how much more is it on you to vet, to test, to prove when it comes to who you're listening to? Because there are those that then buy into that mess, because that mess is going to appear to be right. You guys thought it when you were in the churches for a while. You thought you'd found the truth, because a lot of you came out of the worldly mess, all the horrible lifestyle things, and found Christianity, and Christianity turned out to be very helpful in cleaning up some of your mess. And you thought, wow, I've arrived, because it masqueraded as a place of light, when still you were in so much darkness. And that's how Hasatan does things. Satan does things not by being obvious and evil and lustful in the flesh and all that stuff, by giving you partial righteousness and partial truth and partial light mixed with other stuff. It's the mixture that will kill you. So he doesn't give you a bottle of poison. He gives you something to drink that's totally good for you with poison in it. So you think, oh, this is healthy, this is good for me, maybe some sort of healthy juice mix of some sort. And you go, wow, that all looks good. You don't know that some arsenic or something else was poured into it as well. Because you didn't do enough research to find out that there was more than those ingredients in there. Oh, what's in there? Well, you know, it's got oranges and apples and all kinds of other wonderful fruit and stuff, pineapple or mango or whatever, you know. Oh, by the way, there's also a little bit of poison. And that's the stuff that'll kill you. So we got to be careful with that. So here's a warning to us to be really careful, because he's linking that to those out there that are false emissaries, deceptive workers. By the way, I want us to be very careful with this. When it says things like deceptive workers, I don't think Paul for a second is saying that they're doing it on purpose, that they're actively trying to deceive you. I'm sure there are a few. But almost everybody you've met in ministry, probably for the most part, probably, generally speaking, had a good, full intention of thinking they're doing right. They were not trying to deceive you. They believed what they were selling. Okay? So when he talks about false emissaries, deceptive workers masquerading as emissaries of Messiah, that's not something they're doing necessarily on purpose or consciously. But to you, they look like they're servants of Messiah. Everybody you went to church that had a podium and a microphone that called themselves pastor, all claimed to be emissaries of Messiah. And I'm sure most of them really believed it and still do. I'm sure there's a small percentage maybe that are there very well knowing they're fleecing the flock in some way, but that's probably such a small percentage it could hardly be measured compared to how many people are doing it in a genuine way. Even if they were bad at it, their heart was to try to do this genuine thing. I don't think they consciously thought, I'm going to fleece the flock. Okay, some, very few. But yet, that's because they're following a Hasatan who looks like Yeshua in their mind. He's masquerading as an angel of light. You know, we have this in the Beware False Prophets teaching. The Jesus of mainstream Christianity is masquerading as Yeshua of the scriptures. Yes or no? Okay? And so then what do we have? We have a Hebrew roots movement, a Messianic movement, all kinds of other people who want you to believe that it's just the semantics about the name and it's not about the masquerading. It's not about what it represents and who it represents and how it represents him. Oh, what's the difference? It's just a name. You've heard me teach. I've never made it about the pronunciation of the name. It's always been about how the name is being used and what it's being used to represent. It's being used to masquerade. In other words, I talk about like a false costume overlay over the truth, and then you have this very sort of 60s flower child Jesus who looks like he came from Haight-Ashbury or something. You know, straight from San Francisco. Love, peace, and I mean, he didn't look anything like that. Okay? But yet, this is the image they want us to have. And so, Paul says, look, it's no wonder. You know, with all these things, it's no wonder that you have these things, because people are buying into what looks like truth when it's not. Just understand, he's saying there are false emissaries and all deceptive workers, etc., and no wonder, because it's easy for them to be following what they think is Yeshua, but it's not. What they think is the Father, but it's not, because the masquerading that's going on the highest levels with Hasatan himself and his emissaries, his servants. Wow. You're going to have to be on the highest level of vigilance, and you're going to have to not just buy into and take everything that comes along and really test and prove, because there's a lot of ones out there that seem very good, very legitimate, very whatever, and it's not. Okay, it's not going to be that way. You're going to come to realize that it's not like you want it to be. Oh, but I like this person in there. I like their teachings and I like their personality. And this other guy, well, I know he's teaching whatever, but I don't like him, and he's caustic and harsh and whatever. Don't be about the messenger, be about the message. Okay? Are you hearing what you need to hear? Are you hearing it clean and unfettered and unfiltered and unblemished as best as can be done? Are you hearing something that resonates with you because, after all, it's familiar, because it's Messacostal, a Messabaptist, a Methacat, whatever it is. It's Messianic mixed with whatever denomination you came from. Because that's still going to have the familiar to it. Look, there's a reason why we generally try to avoid all Christian, mainstream, contemporary Christian music in our praise and worship. Why? Because it will trigger that comfort in you back to where you used to be. Or for some of you that are glad you left, it'll trigger some irritation because you want to get away from it. Which is sad, because some of the songs are great. I mean, if you read the lyrics of them, there were some really, really powerfully well-written songs. Sadly, though, they're connected with an emotional response. And some of you know that. I could play certain songs and you're like, wow, I'm right back there. I played a congregation that had some of their praise music, and Manny and Michelle were listening to it, and they were like, oh, wow, that's right back to where we were when we were playing praise music years ago. They're like, see, it could take you right back, which is why we don't do that here, okay? And if anything slips through, I don't want anybody to say, oh, I might miss one. I was never in contemporary Christianity. I don't know what's what. Okay, so I try my best to try to filter things out. That's why mostly what we're trying to do now is have Michelle and my daughter and Manny and them, write new songs. Then it can't be any question that they're not from there, okay? And we have lots of new songs being written. But we have to be careful, because there is an active agenda of Hasatan and his emissaries to convince you that they and he are Yeshua and Yeshua's emissaries. That is an active agenda, and you must be aware of it. And don't get all like, well, it'll be obvious and I'll figure it out because you're still thinking like Christianity wants you to think, which is the enemy is going to be this overtly obvious, evil-looking, scary thing. No. Paul tells you really clearly, Hasatan himself looks to you and can look to you as a messenger of light. Even you would think he's Yeshua himself. You would be so impressed if he manifested himself that way, which is why people will bow down to the false Messiah when he comes, because he will look like everything they think he should look like. Key word is what they think he should look like. You've been sold an image. See, that's part of the darkness and light thing. Hopefully, I've helped enlighten you so that you won't be fooled by what really is darkness that's going to present itself as light. And so it's not about the semantics. It's not about how you pronounce his name. What image is linked to the name? And one of the things that drives me more frustrated than anything is the teachers out there that will say Yeshua/Jesus on their websites or when they correspond or when they're speaking or, I'm sorry, but they're not presented the same way. And it's not about the name, as lots of people who are attacking us right now would try to say. Well, in my King James it says, well, you know what? There's a lot of problems with your King James. For all you all you King James only people. All right? And so, well, it says Jesus in my King James. All right, so that's the English translation they put there. I don't really mind how he was translating a name. I'm looking at 2,000 years of how the name was used to convince you of a particular behavioral image that you're imitating. Okay, that name is used to bring you into darkness or stay in darkness because it does away with all the law. You can't be in the light if the law is done away with and nailed to the cross. We were already told that earlier about the whole circumcised and uncircumcised. We just read that in Romans, right? The one that's actually keeping the covenant and doing the Torah is the one that actually is covenanted and walking in light. You who think you're covenanted might actually be in darkness if you're not doing it, is what he was telling people. So if in the name of one, we are feeling like, wow, we honor and respect that every word that comes out of the mouth of Elohim, we must embrace and do as our Messiah did, or the other name that's used to say, oh, no, that's all been done away with. If we can't see that simple difference, we're in trouble. So it's not just about pronouncing the name. Because they'll say, well, we go back to the Greek, and they'll go, I don't care. I probably wouldn't even have that big a deal of a problem with the name, even though I would say that he never had a Greek name, if it wasn't being used like this. But it's being used, and that's the problem. And you have a hard time, if you were raised that way, disconnecting that image from that name. It's almost impossible for you to disconnect that process of behavior, what you felt was the right way to do things in the context of your Creator, in the Messiah, under that name, and then connect it differently to torah-observant, covenant, and still keep that other name. There's a disconnect in our brain. And so therefore, those who want to keep holding on to the name, that other name, the Jesus name, we'll call it right out what it is, I'm sorry, but there's still a darkness that you are refusing to come out of. Okay? And I'm not claiming that, I can prove that the way we pronounce his name, Yeshua, Yehoshua, whatever it is exact right, whatever. I know that the oldest manuscripts in the Aramaic have it as Yeshua. And so I understand that. Even what looks like might be attacks on him in the Talmud call him Yeshua or Yeshu. It doesn't have these other things. But that's not the argument. The argument is, what does it represent? Because after all, we're becoming transformed into the image of one or the other. What's the image connected to each name? I mean, that's the simplicity. What image is connected to the name? One will lead you into the light. The other will keep you immersed in darkness under false light. It's not enough that you know that he came, was born, and lived a life, was crucified, and then was resurrected. I mean, that knowledge is important, but it's not enough. If it doesn't transform you or cause you to desire transformation, because just that information alone doesn't change anything. But because you have the information, you should be inspired to transform. Because seeing light, I hate to use this metaphor, but how people talk about this near-death experiences and they see a light or whatever, and seeing it's not the point. It's going towards. Now, I'm not saying that those experiences are real or false or anything else. I'm just using that picture for you that even in those things, seeing the light wasn't the point. Going towards it. Well, if Yeshua is the light and torah-observant is the light of what Yeshua came to show us, then knowing about it doesn't do anything. You have to go towards. You have to imitate. He says, imitate me. He says, follow me. The word in the Greek means be in like manner as. Do what I do. Act like I act. Paul says, let this mind be in you, Philippians 2:5, the one that was in Messiah. How did he think? Well, he said, everything my Father says, I do. Everything my Father says to say is what I say. Well, if Yeshua was the one on Mount Sinai giving the commandments, and he only says what the Father tells him to say, well, it might as well have came straight from the Father. Because he said, I only say what my Father tells me to say. He is the voice of the Father. Okay, my sheep hear my voice. That's part of the Do You Know the Father and the Son teaching, starting in part 6, I believe. Okay? And so we have to understand him as the word, as the voice, as the spokesperson. And he maintains that position in the Brit Chadashah when he says, I only say what he tells me to say. I'm here to speak for him. I am the express image of the Father. How? Because when you look at me, you might as well be looking at him, because everything I do is what he does. You're supposed to become the express image of the Son, which means everything you say and do should reflect how he would say and do it. Well, that's why we have a teaching called, What Did Yeshua Do? I love when I mention these things and all the Gadol kids are like, hurry up, okay, write that one down. He mentioned the teaching. All right? Because, you see, we sometimes forget that he didn't just keep Torah because he was a Jew before he was, crucified and resurrected. He came into this world a Jew. He lived and taught as a Jew. And guess what? When he's resurrected, he's still a Jew. When he comes back as a Messiah, he'll still be a Jew. But he's not going to be a hypocrite Jew like Paul was attacking, and Yeshua attacked as well, the hypocrisy part. He says, don't be a hypocrite. You were chosen. But don't just sit on that and go, well, I'm chosen. No, you were chosen to do something. And in doing, you were then chosen to become something through the doing. And that was to come out of darkness, the darkness of slavery in Egypt when they were called to go to Sinai, into the light of Torah. The Jewish community understands very much thinking of the Torah as light, the light of Torah. They have no problem understanding that. Embracing it and walking it out, that's really where the challenge comes out, okay? So I think this part here in 2 Corinthians, we need to take this part seriously. This is not actually even for me for speaking. This is for you to understand and you to do. I'm here to just read what Paul said. He warned the people in Corinth. I'm warning all of you. You need to understand that this is going on right now around you and available to you wherever you look for leadership and teaching and ministry. And there are false ones out there, deceptive workers who are masquerading, or by masquerading meaning they look and sound to you very on the surface as if they're emissaries of Messiah. But you need to dig deeper. Because don't be fooled, Hasatan himself, who you think of as the scary, evil, whatever, if he showed up, you'd think he was Messiah. or whatever. I mean, it would be so impressive. You'd probably fall down on your face because he would look every bit the part that you would expect him to look. That's why when Messiah, the false one, comes, when that Messiah, the false Messiah comes, there's no doubt even the elect could be deceived because of how impressive he will be and the things that he will do. And some of you, if you haven't figured this out, when he says things, and I taught this in the other teaching, but when he says things like, oh yeah, no, they were right. The law has been done away with, and Sunday is great, and Christmas and Easter. Some of you whose hearts have not let go of that stuff will be like, I knew it. Oh, I'm so glad I can go back to all that stuff. And you'll go right back to it like a dog to its vomit. You'll go right back to it because you don't have the discernment necessary to see through the masquerade. There's a charade going on. And it's being put on by someone smarter than you will ever be. Hasatan is way smarter than all of us ever will be. He is the greatest thing that Abba ever made. He says that he was one of his greatest creations. The genius that is there, the brilliance that is there, we can't even come close to. So that effort to deceive you is on the highest levels of understanding your weaknesses and susceptibility. And so you could end up in the darkness thinking you're in the light. And that's the biggest challenge for you. Please embrace this little piece here in 2 Corinthians. It is very, very important that you understand that. All right, let's go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, and we're going to begin in verse 1. And it's funny, I shouldn't say so, it's very cool to me how a lot of the verses that I've picked that actually deal with the darkness, they build actually on the previous things that Paul was saying to Romans and to the Corinthians, and now we're going to see, look at how this starts off. Become then imitators of Elohim as beloved children. Isn't that what we were just talking about? And walk in love as Messiah also has loved us and gave himself for us a gift and an offering to Elohim for a sweet-smelling fragrance. But whoring and all uncleanness or greed of gain, let it not even be named among you, as is proper among set-apart ones. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather thanksgiving. For this you know, that no one who whores, nor unclean one, nor one greedy of gain, who is an idolater, has any inheritance in the reign of Messiah and Elohim. Okay, so start there. So just like we've been talking about, and we're going to get to the idea of light and darkness here in verse 8, but he's saying, look, this is the whole point. We're supposed to become imitators of Elohim. How do we imitate the Father? Well, we've never seen the Father. But we have Yeshua to imitate. And Paul in other places has said things like, imitate me as I imitate Messiah. So we're to be imitators of Elohim. How? We are to find anointed appointeds that are imitating Messiah, and that's how Paul explains it too. Imitate me, who you can interact with, because Messiah is not here physically. As I imitated Messiah, I learned, and as he imitates the Father. This is called discipleship. Okay? This is what true discipleship is. And so he's saying, look, become then imitators of Messiah as beloved children and walk in love as Messiah also has loved us. Now remember, the teaching I did called Love and Torah. I need to redo it, but in that one you'll find that almost every place love is mentioned, especially in the Tanakh, it's connected to the Torah observance. And you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, might, and being, and guard his commandments almost everywhere. Even Yeshua says, if you love me, guard my commands. Love and commandment obedience, or commandment guarding, commandment submission is always together. So when he says, walk in love, Torah teaches us how to love each other and how to love him. That's how you walk it out. So it's loving when we keep Shabbat, keep the feast, don't eat the foods we shouldn't eat, that we don't do idolatry, don't steal, don't, commit adultery, don't murder. This is all love to each other and to him, having no other Elohim before him, honoring mother and father, keeping Shabbat, keeping the feasts. These are all love towards him and then also love towards each other. Equal weights, equal measures, honest day's pay for honest day's work. So when he says walk in love, it's not just that, again, 60s Yeshua, Jesus thing, or whatever they want to call him in the movies, who goes around, love, 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 like the Beatles song, right? All you need is love, da, 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 right? He's not wrong in that song, but you need love, and love is expressed through the Torah. How you love each other is expressed through the Torah. And this is important. So Paul is not confused here, throwing out something different. He's assuming that students, the people he's teaching here in his congregation and the Ephesian congregation will understand when he says to walk. The walk in the word in Hebrew would be halakha, the walk, the halech, to walk out. In love, as Messiah also loved us by setting an example and keeping of the commands. And then he gave himself, or, Yeshua said, no greater love can one have but to give himself or lay down his life for his brother. A gift and an offering to Elohim. But he says, look, if you're going to do any of this other stuff in verse 3, 4, 5, okay, those things are not expressions of love. Those things are not going to get you in. Those things are not part of being a set-apart one. He says, these things are not proper among set-apart ones, verse 3. He says, for this you should know that these people who are doing all these unclean things, he says, they don't have any inheritance in the reign of Messiah and Elohim. See, inheritance, same idea as reward. Aren't the Ephesians saved, as Christianity would claim? Or half the Messianic or more, the majority of Messianic movement would claim that, they're all saved because these are all people Paul was talking to. They believe Yeshua was, born and died and raised and all that stuff. Then what's this inheritance thing that they could blow? Apparently the once saved, always saved has nothing to do with getting the inheritance. And I agree, by the way, with the idea, if you understand salvation correctly, you were provided once forever with that opportunity. That part is forever. Doesn't get you the inheritance, though. But without it, you can't get the inheritance. You need salvation, or there is no inheritance. Please go listen to the Are You Saved teaching until you get it, all right? Because it's the inheritance or the reward that is separate from salvation, although only made possible if you have salvation made available to you, that Paul's talking about. If you are someone who knows about Messiah, let me just go back to something. Okay, in chapter 1, I want you to understand who he's talking to. In Ephesians chapter 1, he said, blessed be the Elohim, in verse 3, of the Father, our master Yeshua Messiah, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenlies in Messiah, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be set apart and blameless before him in love. Those people can still blow it and not get the inheritance. You would think chapter 1 is talking to, as mainstream Christianity would think of, as saved people. Why is he telling saved people? He says here, this you know, that no one who whores, nor unclean one, nor one greedy of gain, who is an idolater, has any inheritance. But he's warning these people. He's not telling you, by the way, feel good about yourselves because you guys are all saved. Those people out there that are doing all this stuff, they're not getting anything. No, he's trying to warn them, be careful what you're doing, because it starts off with, become then imitators of Messiah, who did not do whoring and uncleanness and all this other stuff. So, they can lose their inheritance, or they won't have an inheritance. He says, these people, he says, for this you know that no one who does these things has any inheritance in the kingdom of the Messiah, of kingdom of Elohim. Please understand that there is no confusion here except that which was taught to you for 2,000 years by the once saved, always saved mainstream Christian crowd. Or however long, whenever, I don't even know when that started. It might have been a few hundred years when they started teaching that, as Christianity sort of came into the established Catholic Church and that whole thing. But at some point within the last 1,700 or so years, that became the adopted mindset, where there is a disconnect between salvation and inheritance being separate. They've been merged together, that if you have one, you have them both. Paul clearly, in my opinion anyway, is saying that's not true. He's saying, look, if you don't become imitators of Elohim and then be beloved children and walk as Messiah walked, you're not going to have an inheritance. He's talking to those in verse 1 that he said, and he chose us to be set apart and blameless. If chosen ones are not saved ones according to their doctrine and their understanding, I don't know what is. I would guess. Maybe I'm the one who's confused. There you go. Whoever's out there is going to quote me out. See, Rabbi said he's confused. That was sarcasm. Okay. That was sarcasm. Look, you got to understand. He's telling us that there is an inheritance that you could squander. We've got opportunities to embrace. That's the point of what we see in Jacob and Esau. That's a lot of the point when Paul's trying to get in the face of those of the circumcision who, notwithstanding the circumcision, quote unquote, can end up being like the uncircumcised and have nothing because of their choices of behavior and submission. Remember, we talk about darkness and light. It has to do with either being under the right authority or the wrong authority or no authority. And just because you speak as if you have authority doesn't mean that you're actually walking correctly in authority. And that's really a big problem here. He's saying, look, let no one deceive you with empty words, verse 6. Could there be any more empty words that, hey, once saved is always saved, make an altar call, nothing else to do, you're in, congratulations, here's your golden ticket. Those are empty words. Those are empty words. He says, no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these, the wrath of Elohim comes upon the sons of disobedience. The empty words lead people to be disobedient. Because the empty words tell you the law was done away with, so when you don't do the law, guess what you are? Disobedient. But these are empty words. And because of these, the wrath of Elohim is going to come on the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not become partakers with them. Okay. Your choice. I don't want to sound cultish. I don't want to sound dictatorial. But if you're going to be submitting yourself and following all these other teachers that you know are teaching all of this mixed mess stuff, are you not partaking with them to some degree? You know, that's your choice. Is don't become partakers with them, those that are being, being offered these empty words. If you know, now of course when you knew, you don't know. But when you come to know that the teacher you're listening to is teaching something that's incorrect, that's not scripturally correct, of course you got to be careful that you're actually qualified to make that decision. Okay, but because at some point you're so new, you're not going to know what's what. So it's going to take a little bit of time. Why do you still listen to them? I mean, there's a bunch of teachers out there. I don't know why anybody's still listening to them. And I'm not trying to pick on them. They need to shut up, I'm sorry to say it that way, and go get trained. I mean, they need to put that mic down and go recognize that you didn't know anything when you started and you just picked up a mic and started talking. Well, go get trained first. Otherwise, you could be partaking with them and causing others to stumble. Because you're telling them as in an authoritative way, it's this, this, and this, when it's really not this, this, and this, but it's that, that, and that. And that's, and people are going to look, oh, you just want everybody to just listen to you. I just want you to listen to him. And if a teacher's not speaking him correctly, then why do you keep, but I like him. And you don't understand how important he was in my transition out of the church and blah, blah, blah. I'm glad all that was true, but so what? I mean, really. Almost all of you, if you had, and a lot of you have these testimonies of terrible lifestyle choices, other things that were happening, can point to teachers in Christianity and pastors that helped you out of that mess. But you moved on eventually from them when you realized they'd only taken you so far. Appreciate that they took you so far. I mean, it's, absolutely appreciate that. But it only took you so far. Don't let your emotional attachment cause you to stumble. He says here, continuing, he says, therefore do not become partakers with them because you were once darkness. See, here's the point. But now you are light in the Master. Walk as children of light. Yeshua is the light. The Torah is the light. Thy word is a lamp unto my path, unto my feet. Okay? He wants you to walk as children of light. What does children mean? What does it mean to be child of light? In other words, born of, following in, instructed by, fed by, provided and protected by. That's what happens. What does a child do? But we also think of the phrase as a idiomatic phrase for meaning a student of, a disciple of. That being a child of the living Elohim, a child of the Master, this is who you feed on, this is who you receive from, this is who provides for you. He says, walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth. And in case you don't understand the context of all of this, as he's saying, well, what is the fruit of the Spirit? Well, we know the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, etc. Is in all goodness and righteousness. So the fruit of the fullness of what he intended is going to be in all righteousness and truth, which is the Torah, which is Yeshua. Yeshua said, I am the truth. And it's in proving, this is the key word, your job, not mine. I guess somewhat it's mine to try to prove to you that it should be in there, but you need to prove what is well-pleasing to the Master in your life. You need to understand and prove it. If you're going to be a child of light, you need to prove what is well-pleasing to the Master. Not well-pleasing to me or some other pastor or your friend, your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, whatever, but what is actually well-pleasing to him. Okay? Now, and have no fellowship. Back to what we were saying earlier about being partakers. Have no fellowship with the fruitless works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Okay? Now, the reproof part, we'll get to that in a second. Let's deal with the fellowship part. Have no fellowship with the fruitless works of darkness. I can't tell you how many people have been through here. Of course, naturally, I assume what I'm teaching is correct. Otherwise, why would I be teaching it, right? So I'm going on that assumption. You are the ones who have to decide whether it's true or not. But I've watched people leave here and go places that they know are teaching wrong. Because I know the issues that they've had in the past with certain things, but they'll go someplace else, knowing full well that they're teaching this mixed mess that we would call darkness. Darkness being a place that has a void or a lack of actively useful light. I'm not saying darkness meaning they're in complete worldly, fleshly life. Okay? Because a lot of you went to churches where they certainly were trying to avoid the most openly, overtly, fleshly, worldly ways of behavior. And that's part of how you came out of some of those things. He says, have no fellowship, though, with the fruitless works. So that means you should not interact with, that's the idea of fellowshipping, with those fruitless works. Fruitless works. Okay, so now he's telling you that works are important, and there's two types. Ones that bear fruit, and here he calls the other ones that are fruitless. The child of light understands that light is where the fruitful works are. By walking in truth, walking in spirit, walking in Torah, walking in Yeshua. He says, but don't have any fellowship. You could read that any way you want. As far as some of you that want to go and hang out and do what you want to do, oh, but they're my friends and I like them and everything else. But it says have no fellowship with that. So I don't know what that means. It's specifically talking about the fruitless works, not necessarily the people. Other places it says don't have any fellowship with those that are revilers. You interpret it any way you want. I'm not going to tell you who you could spend time with or not. That's your choice. But you need to ask him and ask yourself, what does that look like in my life, or what's it supposed to look like in my life? To not have fellowship with the fruitless works of darkness, but rather reprove them. By reprove, it has to do with, I wouldn't say that means you have to go reprove the person, but expose them in other words, understand it for yourself so that you know to avoid it. You might have a relationship with somebody where you can go and talk to them directly, but be careful that you go and reprove somebody that your relationship doesn't actually warrant that. You are not to reprove anybody that your relationship does not allow for that. If I am your teacher and you are my student, I have a responsibility and a relationship where I can reprove you. If you are my friend, or you have somebody who you're good friends, or your family, you may have a relationship where you can reprove each other. But we should not be reproving just anybody that we don't have a relationship with first. Otherwise, they're just going to be angry with you for thinking you have a right to reprove them. Okay, so don't do that. Okay? Don't go ahead and do these things. He says, have no fellowship with the fruitless works of darkness, but rather reprove. It has to do with confuting or exposing. In other words, see it for what it is, and then don't interact with it. He says, rather see it for what it is and avoid it and don't interact with it. Okay? He says, for it is a shame even to speak of what is done by them in secret, but all matters being reproved are manifested by the light. So all matters being exposed are manifested by light. Once you see it for what it is, see, that's trying to give you the same definition for reproof there. Once you see it for what it is, it's exposed by the light. It's being manifested by the light. For whatever is manifested is light. In other words, whatever is manifested then enlightens you. You now can see things as they really are. Not that what you see necessarily itself is light. You may see something that's wrong, but that's light for you because now you see it as wrong. It's now enlightening to you. That is why he says, wake up, you who sleep, and arise from the dead, and Messiah shall shine on you. Okay, so when he says wake up, you who sleep and arise from the dead, he's talking about those that are called that have been doing nothing. Israelites that are scattered, that have not been walking it out. He's not talking to Gentiles here. He's talking to called ones, even if they were Gentiles, but those that are called. Those from chapter 1, those who were from the foundation, preordained, and that they would be called to be set apart ones, that it was their opportunity to do this. All right? He's saying you are not all doing it. You need to wake up. He says, wake up, you are asleep. In other words, you're complacent. You're just sort of trudging along, and arise from the dead, and Messiah shall shine on you. See then that you walk exactly, not as unwise, but as wise. Don't just pick and choose and do some or partial or whatever. You need to walk exactly. Exactly how? As Yeshua walked, as he instructed. He says, redeeming the time because the days are wicked. Time's short. You have no idea how much time you have. I said, look, I had a ministry before. We called it Now is the Time Ministries. You know why? Because now is the time. Whatever now is always the time. You only have now. He says, redeeming the time because the days are wicked. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the desire of Elohim is, what Yahweh is. That's what you need to be doing. It goes back to, again, using that discernment to understand, to seek and understand what it is, what's the well-pleasing desire of Elohim. Amen? Amen. Father, we come before you. And Father, we want to understand truly how to be out of the darkness and in the light. We want to understand what is well-pleasing in your sight and then to walk in that. We want to become imitators of you, imitators of Yeshua. Father, help us to have the wisdom and discernment, eyes to see, ears to hear, so that we can make the tough choices about where we are fed and who we're fed by, etc. Father, we are really, as we do often, struggle. Okay, we struggle because, let's happen to be looking down at verse 17 of chapter 4. He says, because we should no longer walk as Gentiles walk in the futility of our minds, which have been darkened in our understanding. And darkened in our understanding is because we're listening to the wrong things and the wrong people, which have caused us to be estranged from the life of Elohim because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. Father, we have to understand this in chapter 4. I might have to go back to that next week. So, Father, we just want to thank you that you can help us to no longer walk as the world walks in a futile way, but that we could rather walk in the light in a fruitful way. So, Father, we come to you, praising you, thanking you, and asking and seeking your mercy and your compassion and your encouragement as we endeavor to do these things. And then we do all, as always, in the name and authority of your Son, our Messiah, Yeshua. And together we say, Amen, Amen, Amen.